Looking for local? Even more local? CCX Media gives you the option to connect with your community on multiple levels. CCX Create welcomes you, community residents, to connect and experience television in an exciting way. The free TV classes we offer will have you on your way to creating TV, and our wide variety of content can be watched at home or on the go. Connect to what's happening in your community. Visit ccxmedia.org.
Then the third leg of that stool is higher education, and so talk about Minnesota State, formerly known as MNSCU.
MNSCU is a very important system. Education, again, is extraordinarily important. I've been getting feedback as I've traveled the state with people's different experiences through MNSCU, and my job, first of all, is to make sure we're getting the biggest bang for our buck, that we have high expectations, that we're serving the needs of our students, but also of our state and our communities. I know for a fact that we have good jobs in Minnesota that aren't getting filled because we don't have the right skill set. So making sure we're engaging and understanding what employers are looking for, what Minnesotans are looking for, is critical. And I know Governor Dayton's done some work around that, but I think we have more to do. And with my clean energy economy and the training for that, we do have a couple of schools that train on that, but I know that we will need to do some work around that as well. But making sure that we are also educating for that next generation of jobs. Because past jobs are going away, they're getting automated, and there's this new next generation, and we've got to keep our eye on the prize so we don't get stale as a state and we keep reinventing ourselves. So, but higher education. The University of Minnesota is an extraordinary research institution. We should be leveraging their research and knowledge more in solving real-world problems. I've done some great work with them through U-Spatial and doing some GIS mapping of our civil infrastructure in a really simple manner. Where does it sit? How old is it? How is it performing financially? Is it in the pipeline for a low-interest loan? What's the population? What are the rates being charged for the users? Our cities have most of our civil infrastructure, so but after having done a cooperative project with them and a bunch of state agencies, I'm on fire. So we needed to make sure we're doing all we can. We had grad students helping build out these maps, and they were being paid through a grant that I received and then another grant that I got to solve real world problems. Tuition is an issue, at least for the University of Minnesota, and affordability. And so I also will be working and looking at that in terms of what can we do as a state to make sure that people have access to higher education. I don't want to leave any minds behind. Mm-hmm. You know, we want to help people reach their full potential because we know it benefits all of us. It benefits our state. So.
It does. One of the realities of education funding in Minnesota, we used to have a 2/3, 1/3 rule, and it kind of flipped. Mm-hmm. Have we just abandoned the kids, or is there something in the system that's making the cost too high?
So I listened to a futurist at a conference that I was at about 6-7 years ago. They talked about this very issue. So I've always paid attention to finance, and I am part of a couple different financial organizations nationally, and I've always worked to keep up on what's the latest, what's the newest, how are state budgets doing, what are the stresses. And really what they've been talking about with the stresses is that as healthcare costs grow, you're not going to cut back on your commitment generally to K-12. It's really hard for elected officials to do, so they predicted that the squeeze was going to be on higher ed. They said it's really the only place to go. And so I contend that we have to work out and iron out the unnecessary costs in our healthcare system. We really, really have to get on that. And they should be doing it at the federal level. And if they're not willing to do a universal system at the federal level, then we need to tackle it at the state level, and I'll be coming out with a plan for that. It's critical so that we can invest in those things that we find to be very, very important and critical to our common good.
Wow. Okay, let's switch to law enforcement. I, as you know, was teaching at Metropolitan State University until just recently, and in a wonderful program called MAPL, the Masters in Advocacy and Political Leadership. Yes, that's a paid advertisement. I'll leave an extra cup of coffee or something. but it's a great program and there's one of our students right here at the station. Mm-hmm. But those students were very, very involved. It happens because there were many students of color were very involved in the reality that about 7% of Minnesota's population is black, and about 37% of our prisoners are black. And there are comparable figures for other students of color. Talk about that if you would. I mean, yes. It's one of the kind of great difficulties of our society nationally, as well as here.
I would agree, and I've been digging. First of all, the MAPL program, awesome. I've met many of your students, and they learn so much from you, and they're out doing really good work too. So you should be very proud. You've really worked to change Minnesota for the better in many ways around public policy. You know, right now we've got an issue, first, that not all Minnesotans feel safe in their community, and that's something that we must address, because all Minnesotans need to feel safe. And I don't want to demonize anybody while working on this. I don't mind digging into difficult issues and looking at what is it that we want to accomplish, what's not right. So when you look at the data, there's a disproportionate percentage of the population in prison from our minority community, and that's something that should disturb all of us. And I know that, again, when you have a roof over your head and a job, you know, economic opportunity, that goes a long way. We have a big economic gap in Minnesota for our minority population. Mm-hmm. We have one of the largest home ownership gaps for our minority population in the nation. We have some issues with outcomes for our minority children in schools. It's getting better, but we still have a gap. So we want to lift all and make sure we're doing the best we can on behalf of all Minnesotans. Everybody matters. And I tell people, I don't care if you live on a reservation, North Minneapolis, Crookston, Caledonia, May Township, St. Paul. We're all Minnesotans, and we're one big family. And I say, too, we might not always agree with each other. We might not always like each other, but we are family, and we must care about each other. And so an issue like this, where there's this out of proportion part of our population that's in the prisons, we must examine that. And I would start with decriminalizing, first of all, low-level drug offenses. That's one. Looking at our policing and police training and tactics would be two. And I know people in public safety. I know they want to get home to their families at night. And they need to be safe as well. And the way the real world plays out sometimes is deeply unfortunate. We've seen that too. And we have everyone's attention. Everyone's paying attention, in my opinion, to some of the really tragic deaths we've had in the recent handful of years. And so it's incumbent upon us as Minnesotans to dig in and do something better. And I would say also we should be looking at best practices. But community policing, I know, helps. I think that if we could get law enforcement to pause before taking action, just count to 10, you know what I mean? Because we know that people have natural biases. We know there's prejudice. There's all kinds of things that impact how we behave at the end of the day and when things are happening fast. So anyway, I'm ready to dig in and work on reforms with our law enforcement system and incarceration. And one thing I will say is a bright line for me as governor: we will not privatize prisons in the state of Minnesota.
Good.
It's a really, really bad idea.
Yeah. Yeah, the incentive creation on private prisons is just
it's
really
not a good
tough.
idea. That would just exacerbate it. So for me, it's look at the data. I'm a big data person and a big evidence person. Look at the data, find best practices. I know there's other models in other places. I think one of the pressures we have is there's a lot of firearms out there too, and our law enforcement folks need to be safe. And so just imagine being in these situations all the time where your life may be on the line. It's a hard job.
Yeah.
You know. So anyway, but on the other side, some of our fellow Minnesotans have reported that they don't feel safe, and that's a real problem for us to solve.
And it sounds like you're saying that safety will, it's not about well, no, this would be putting words in your mouth.
Do you want me to repeat what I think
No.
you're saying?
I wanted to shift because there has, been a recent event around guns. I just wondered whether guns matter at all in this argument, or whether we don't really have to talk about that. We have to talk about what we're doing with people as opposed to what we're doing with guns.
Right, that's a really big, broad issue, but I would say what we're doing with people, how we treat our people, how we train, how we approach crisis situations. I'll tell you another big issue, I'll just call it out, mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Doctors, we don't have enough doctors to provide mental health services statewide, and I heard it all over the state. It's going to be a big priority of mine. Destigmatize it, talk about it, and get at it, because it's a fundamental piece of our health. And I was in Bemidji, and they said to me, when we had someone who had a mental health crisis, they had to hold them in the emergency room for 4 days before they could locate a bed, and then they had to ship them off. And I heard of another parent in Brainerd whose son had a crisis. He was shipped to North Dakota, and then she got called 3 days later saying, come pick him up. Well, she had to work, and what we're doing is not working. Yeah. We don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough services, and we need to make sure that when our fellow Minnesotans need help, that it's there for them. So that's just another layer.
Do you have any?
I have lots of questions, but not the good voice today. So, one of the concerns is you're currently in the courts fighting a 2015 legislative decision that impacted your office of state auditor. Can you give us updates on where the case is right now?
Yes, I would love to. So I maintain that the legislature carried out an unconstitutional act in 2015. In the middle of the night, last day of session, they tucked a provision into an omnibus finance bill that was going to fund state government that worked to privatize not my office, the people's office. It's a constitutional office. It is a deterrent to make sure that we don't have bad things happening in government. It's why Minnesota is known nationally and internationally as being a good government state around finances, that we don't have corruption, cronyism, and money leaking all over. It's happening in other states where this office has been weakened. And so I went to the courts. Look, I took an oath. I swore an oath that I was going to support both the U.S. Constitution and the Minnesota Constitution. This office belongs to the people, and the legislature does not get to gut it. Only the people can vote through a constitutional amendment to get rid of it, and they have not done so. So the update is we got halfway to where I wanted to get to with my lawsuit in the district court, and then we went to the Court of Appeals, and we still got halfway there. But it was a 2-1 split decision, and the chief judge of the Court of Appeals, Ed Cleary, said this law is clearly unconstitutional. I have petitioned the Minnesota Supreme Court. They take very few cases. They're taking the case. And I'm optimistic. Now we're suing on both the single subject clause, we're saying that was violated by this law, and also separation of powers clause. I am loath to spend any money on this lawsuit. But we oversee $20 billion spent per year by local governments. We are a deterrent. Our founders understood that this office needed to be in place. You want a strong deterrent when it comes to taxpayer dollars. Yeah. So in the courts, we've received discounts from the law firm we're working with. It's a very, very good law firm. They have very good people. We have what's called amicus briefs, Friends of the Courts. So there's other groups that are filing briefs in support of this lawsuit. And there's 3 different distinct groups. I just want to highlight one. On the single subject clause, this is where all the problems are occurring. So Governor Dayton's in the courts because the legislature piled a bunch of policy into a finance bill. It's called the garbage bill. You know what it is.
Maybe we could just pause for a second and help folks understand. The single subject rule is in the Minnesota Constitution, and it basically says that a bill is not supposed to have a whole bunch of things in it. It's supposed to be, each bill is supposed to be about a single subject. We've kind of gotten away from it so far that it's there are thousands of subjects in some bills.
And it makes it very hard for a citizen to know what they're opposed to and what they're supportive of.
Believe me, I was a lobbyist. It makes it hard for us to figure it out.
And I've never seen so many lobbyists so upset this last session. It's the worst it's ever been. The public can't follow it, but you know what's even sadder? Legislators can't follow it. And there were so many legislators after this last session who had no idea what ended up in those final bills because things were being added behind closed doors. And that's not the accountable, transparent system that our founders contemplated. I'm asking the courts to weigh in and say what the single subject really means. That's their job. They're there to protect that Constitution. And there's a group that's filing a brief on our behalf to argue on the single subject, provide additional information to the courts. And they want the courts to act on it as well because they haven't for a long, long, long time. And I know that they're very careful to respect the three branches of government. But this one group is the ACLU, Center of the American Experiment, TCF Financial Group, Gender Justice, Growth and Justice. I mean, it's this long, long list of very conservative, very liberal, and everything in between. League of Women Voters. They're basically saying, look, we're all from different communities, different walks of life, but we all want the courts to take care of this because what's been happening at the legislature is not good for anybody. Anybody. All these poison pills getting stuck into finance bills. Governor Dayton had, in the legislature in a lawsuit. It's because of the violations of single subject. So what I would like to share with Minnesotans is I'm optimistic. All filings should be done by the end of October, and then the courts can then schedule oral arguments. And if I'm not successful, I will have done everything in my power to the best of my ability to protect this very important office, and I'll be able to live with myself at the end of the day. But I'm optimistic that the courts are going to make sure that our Constitution means something.
Good.
Talk about the politics of it, if you will, because it has politics in the sense that you will be attacked. Oh, look at this, she's trying to just protect her office, blah, blah, Talk about that part.
Certainly.
It's probably started already.
Well, some people are going to say, well, you spent money. Well, I don't want to spend any money, but I've had to, and they've been our very scarce resources for my office that we've been able to use and still get our work done. And I dare anybody to challenge me on this or to take me on and say it was a waste of money. This is never going to be a waste of money because I know what it looks like when strong deterrents go away. And we're going to look like states that we don't want to look like. We're a good government state for a reason. We have a reputation for that. And when these strong deterrents go away, there's cronyism, corruption, money leaking all over. That is not the Minnesota that we know and that we love. We want, when we're taxed, we want those dollars to be used for what they're supposed to be used for and nothing else. We do a pretty darn good job. And so I'm fighting for that, and that is priceless.
And I think it's important for people to understand that exactly what happened here, that what the law said was a county, for example, could go and hire a private firm. Yep. Now, in Minnesota, everywhere in the country these days, we've driven so hard against government that almost everybody instinctively says, well, if they're private, they must be better, right? If they're private, there's that kind of game that drops down on your case, and that's what makes, I think, this hard for you. And I'm entirely sympathetic because I know that a private firm basically is going to put in a low bid and not use many folks and not get too. They keep the client happy. Your job is not to keep those counties happy. It's to make sure they're doing it right, which is a much different question.
The relationship is different, and this office has had authority over the counties now since the beginning of statehood. And when we audit a county, our client is the taxpayer. Our allegiance is to them and no one else. So we're there to make sure that the financial statements are fairly stated, that they've complied with federal compliance requirements as well as state and everything else. The financial markets rely on the fact that those financial statements are fairly stated. So there's all this work that auditors are required to do, whether they're government auditors auditing government or private sector auditing government. When a private firm is auditing government, their client is the board that gave them the contract. It's a slightly different relationship. There are good firms in Minnesota, and I will say that there are good firms in Minnesota that do their due diligence, but we recently issued a report in our office after reviewing the underlying documentation for firms that are currently auditing counties. And we took at least one from each firm, and a couple firms we took two because they did the majority. And we looked at the underlying documentation, the evidence they used to opine on the financial statements and to make sure they were complying with federal requirements. We found a lot of issues.
Yeah.
A lot of issues. In fact,
and that report is available to everybody
website.
online. I've been looking at it.
Office of State Auditor website, and there are 8 audits that failed to meet the standards. It's a very serious situation for our state. The
That
federal
gets
government,
expensive for the
Oh, yeah.
taxpayers.
Absolutely. And to be fair to the counties, they relied on the system to work. We're not in charge of these private firms, we oversee the counties. And so it's an unfortunate situation that some have attempted to politicize. This work is very serious, and our counties receive a lot of federal funds, and the feds want to make sure this work is done properly as well. And so we are going in and having to do that work to make sure that they have audits that meet the standards, and that's the requirement by law. So we have seen situations where there's low bid, and some counties said, oh, we want cheap audits. If we're going after cheap audits in Minnesota, we're in trouble because you get what you pay for.
Rebecca, earlier you mentioned that you're on several statewide committees, and one of them involves the mining leases up north. You voted one way, and do you think it's going to affect your support up there?
So people may remember that in 2013 I voted against a set of non-ferrous mineral leases. Non-ferrous is not, ferrous is like the taconite and iron. We've been doing that for a very long time. Non-ferrous is the copper, nickel, palladium. We've never mined it in Minnesota, but we have given leases out to companies, and I started voting against them in 2013 because I've seen too many good government studies that show that when government engages with private multinational foreign corporations with this type of mining, we just don't get it right. We never get enough of a damage deposit. So the companies come in, they get the goods, and they get out, and then the taxpayers are left cleaning up that mess. Because the non-ferrous minerals tend to be embedded in sulfuric rock, and that interacts with air and water. Long and the short of it, northern Minnesota, lots of water. So, and it's precious too. So I voted against them because I'm concerned about a couple different things. A governor, any governor, can negotiate that damage deposit behind closed doors. And in the name of jobs, sometimes we go after a short-term gain, but we'll end up with long-term pain. I don't want that. So this should be transparent, the financial assurance piece. 2, we have a state agency, the DNR, that both promotes and regulates mining. Red flag. So there's red flags. And so I want to make sure we're not inheriting a huge financial liability, and that we do our due diligence to make sure we're protected, that we protect where we live, we protect our workers, our communities, and where we live. So is it going to hurt me in an election? Well, my vote was in 2013, and in 2014, when I had to run for re-election, my margin of victory exceeded Congressman Nolan's margin of victory on the Iron Range by 12 points. So even our fellow Minnesotans who live on the Iron Range understand that these companies aren't always there with our best interests. So they're there to serve their shareholders, and we must always remember that. It's incumbent upon us, government, to make sure we have done our due diligence to protect our people and where we live.
Good. And you're a powerful protector of our taxpayers. We're getting close to our deadline.
Okay.
So is there something more that you want to say before we conclude?
2018 is a very important election for very many reasons. And I have a very strong electoral history, and I'm the only one that has that currently who's running on the DFL side for governor. I won more rural counties than Governor Dayton, more rural counties than Governor Pawlenty. In fact, I won over 50% of the rural counties. I have great strength around the state. People know me, they voted for me, they respect me. doing this work in finance and in affordable housing, which I do work in, and farm finance, which I do work in, and public pensions and investments, I have a really solid foundation to do some extraordinary work for Minnesotans. And having served at the executive level, Arnie Carlson was a state auditor for 3 terms. Mark Dayton was a state auditor. It's really extraordinary training to be governor. And I'm hoping that Minnesotans, first that the DFL party will recognize that I am the strongest candidate, and then finally that Minnesotans will recognize that I'd be a great governor. So I'm asking them for their support.
Well, good. You make a great case
Thank you, Bill.
for
Thank
your
you.
election. And thank you, Wyatt, for
Yes, sir.
working so hard as our co-host here.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.